Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's Philosophical Frameworks of Analysis. This is Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. I apologize, my voice is still a little bit hoarse and I'm still have a little bit of brain fog, but we're gonna try to get through these guys. There's a lot of complex ideas going on in here, but these two thinkers are very dominant in the contemporary Western tradition, especially in like the post-ideological age that we kind of sort of find ourselves on the bleeding edge of sort of coming out of that. So a lot of the ideas that we're going to be discussing today are something which have permeated a lot of pop culture, a lot of popular thinking, and have been profoundly influential on like contemporary philosophical discourse, specifically, in the West. Which is interesting because these two are actually very inspired from other parts of the Indo-European tradition, specifically the Indian tradition, both the mystical Upanishad tradition and then the classical Indian philosophy. We're going to get into that as well. Both guys, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, were considered to a degree mystics in their own right. Very revolutionary thinkers, specifically on Nietzsche's approach, revolutionary in a philosophical sense, not necessarily in a material sense, but we'll get to that a bit. And yeah, so let's get right into it. Okay, so beginning with Arthur Schopenhauer, both these guys are German. Schopenhauer was a contemporary of Hegel in a lot of ways. He actually had a lot of there's a lot of jokes online between like the people lining up for Hegel's lectures versus Schopenhauer's. A little bit of overlap in some cases, but we're dealing with transcendental idealism, and we're dealing with people who are very much in the Kantian and Platonic tradition when it comes to that sort of there being a world of forms, there being a noumenal world, which is being addressed beyond the phenomenal world, that the mind and sense perception is incapable of fully grasping the totality of reality. So as it says, Schopenhauer is very inspired by Plato and Kant, but he holds that as opposed to Plato and Kant, who say that the world can be sort of the nature of reality is very amenable to access through rationality, even though it might not be through your sense perception, through your physical interactions. With phenomenon, you can still access through this sort of noumenal rationality. Remember this transcendent ideal of rationality, which is encoded in the idea of freedom. So Schopenhauer kind of agrees with this, but he holds that the universe is not entirely a rational place. Now, Schopenhauer is known as a philosophical pessimist, and one of the people who is really on the forefront. He was one of the first in the German ideal tradition, actually, to come and say that the universe is not something which can be, that true knowledge can't be accessed through rationality alone, which is something that we're familiar with from inductive logics in the Greek and in the French, but not so much in the German. Remember, the Germans had this big fascination with rationality, with this ultimate freedom being the capacity to exercise pure reason, in the Kantian form, as well as this sort of a Platonic dialogue of that there is a noumenal world beyond the phenomenal as accessed through rationality. So just bear that in mind. So rather, Schopenhauer says that it might not be true knowledge which is accessible, like a true holding epistemological, approach to reality, to both the noumenon and the phenomenon, but rather that rationality can be used to mitigate suffering by subduing desire, which is something that we're also familiar with a lot from Kant and from Plato and from a lot of these rational thinkers, is that they would use rationality to par away what was considered like the baser attributes of man, the baser functioning of humanity, of desire, which is considered antithetical to the autonomous being of Kant. And then that would bring us to this sort of self-conscious noumenal human revolution. So Schopenhauer is within this framework. He believes in that power of a noumenal rationality and in a noumenal world, but he sees rationality rather as a tool for the mitigation of suffering. He essentially sees the phenomenal world as, like we say, as a pessimist. It means he places a negative value on existence, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But rationality is a tool, not necessarily for true knowledge and for true freedom, but rather for the mitigation of harm and the mitigation of pain. So he's considered a pessimist, but he didn't despair in his pessimism, which is a very important thing that a lot of people and it's similar with the Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, is that a simple reading of them can often lead a person to a very dark place. Like Nietzsche, for instance, gets associated a lot with nihilism, Schopenhauer with pessimism. But just because these thinkers are staring in the face of this abyss, to an extent, they are fighting against it, and they are saying that the reality is as such, but here are specific tools in which you can actually mitigate the suchness of that reality. Think about Camus, almost, the myth of Sisyphus, like one must imagine Sisyphus happy. So Camus is kind of piggybacking off of this tradition in a lot of ways, their existentialism it sets the stage for French absurdism, which we're going to get into, hopefully, in the next class. So basically, Schopenhauer is considered a pessimist, which, as I said, means that there's a negative value placed on existence. But he articulates ways in which we can minimize pain and overcome the universal human condition, which is described as this sort of a pendulum that swings between pain and boredom, and between the two. So through his aesthetic theory and through his philosophical approach and his metaphysic, he actually outlines all these different ways in which the suffering and the endless suffering of this universe can be tranquilized, he calls it. So Schopenhauer's primary book was called The World as Will and Representation. It's a metaphysical text. So it's dealing with the structure of reality and how things work. And his primary innovation was something called metaphysical voluntarism. Now, voluntarism is any way of thinking in which the will, the raison, takes precedence over the capacity for rationality. So in Spinoza's thinking, well, maybe less Spinoza, but in Kant's thinking, a little bit Spinoza's thinking, and Cartesian thinking, there's this concept of any deductive logic in a lot of ways is dealing with a rationality as this higher form, which is acting through the world. You could even call it Hegel to an extent, but Hegel's an interesting mix of both the will, which is the Geist, and rationality. He just believes that rationality is the way in which the Geist is known. But basically what we're dealing with with Schopenhauer is there's the phenomenal world, which is the world as appearance, which is the world of representation. And this is where Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory, and Nietzsche borrows from this a lot as well, the world as representation is a field of reality, which is the phenomenal world. And that's sort of like reflected through art. Like his aesthetic theory and his artistic theory deals directly with the world as representation. But that the phenomenal world is a product of this blind noumenal will towards life and existence. So basically what he says is that our knowledge of different things, of different phenomena, of separate objects and different subjects, our subjectivity, is a result of the functioning of this noumenal will, which is just blindly and amorally trying to live and is trying to assert its life and assert its existence. Imagine almost like the Big Bang to an extent, is that there's this point, which is the will, and it's just trying to expand and expand and expand and expand and expand. It is blind to rationality. It is blind to morals. It is blind to all of these constructed judgments. This is something which actually, in the Cartesian tradition, we could say that Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and a lot of these thinkers, and even Kant to an extent, they're big believers in the subjectivity of morality. Well, Descartes less so, but Schopenhauer and Nietzsche for sure. There's just this blind amoral will, which is attempting to live, which is attempting to expand. This will eventually become Nietzsche's will to power. But it begins with Schopenhauer's blind will, which creates, through this expansion, unique constructs, which we interact with as phenomenon. So Schopenhauer was incredibly inspired by the Upanishads. In a lot of the salons that he was operating in, and a lot of his colleagues were part of the forefront, which were bringing Sanskrit text into Germany. Sorry, one second. And as a result, there was kind of this permeation of the Sanskrit and the Vedic metaphysics, the Vedic universal structure into the German philosophy at the time. So there's tiers of reality. This exists, by the way, not only in Sanskrit and German, but also in many, many different world religions, like across the Indo-European tradition and beyond, where you have this concept that there are tiers of reality. There's a unity, which then subdivides into an abstract multiplicity. And then that abstract multiplicity then subdivides into a physical multiplicity. So you would think about it as the divine structure, where you would have the divine monad, which is the underlying unity. And then you would have the gods, which are the children of that monad in a mythological sense. And they all represent a specific abstract element, like let's say fire as a form, or apples, fruit as a form, or the wind, storms, all the things that gods in the Indo-European tradition are necessarily associated with as being the abstract form of that thing. And this is also a Platonic way of thinking, you know what I mean? Is you have this unity, then you have a world of forms, which emanates from that unity. The Parmenides dialogue actually gets a lot into that. I think if you recall from our session on Plato. And then those forms then refract into and create a physical reality, and that physical reality is the manifestations of those abstract multiplicities. So let's say, for instance, you would have Demeter, who is the Greek goddess of the harvest and of fertility and plant life and stuff like that. So a tree and a vine and all these things, a vine's complicated, but like vegetation, harvest, all these different physical phenomenon would be sort of a tiered existence that emanates from the realm of the form of Demeter, which in turn emanates from a realm of the monistic unity, right? So that's the metaphysic in a lot of ways. But for Schopenhauer, it's basically the will and its emanation through various kalim, through various ideas. And so basically what you have is the concept of the Platonic ideas, which is that realm of abstract multiplicity. They're the direct objectifications of the will and the immediate objectivity of the will, which means that the will is objectifying certain things in this blind noumenal outpouring, this blind expansion of the will. Circumstantially, without any meaning, it creates these objectifications, and these objectifications lend to the will a quality of objectivity to us who are engaged in the physical multiplicity, and are also able to, through certain things which Schopenhauer prescribes, actually be able to trace back from the physical multiplicity to the abstract multiplicity to the unity. Which is Schopenhauer's, like we said before, he's a pessimist, so he doesn't ascribe a value, a positive value to existence, but a negative value. But through this process of kind of returning the will to its own source, you can mitigate suffering. So we're basically going to be walking from phenomenon to form to monads, what's it called? Noumenon. Right. So Schopenhauer's philosophical pessimism. So if you have this blind will that is abstracting and then coalescing into physical phenomenon, and this will doesn't have a value perceived upon itself, then we as emanations of that don't necessarily have value. However, we do experience things. We experience a lot of pain, and we experience a lot of boredom. Pleasure is kind of less of an issue for him because he's kind of sees desire as the source of a lot of pain and boredom. And pleasure also stems from desire. This is where it's sort of, you can start to hear like some of the inferences from Buddhism or from the Hindu tradition, where you have the concepts of desire, which Schopenhauer originally does want to mitigate because of his situation in the German Kantian and Platonic tradition, in terms of like refining reason, or at least using reason to sort of tame desire. In the Eastern traditions, this desire can either be cultivated That would be something called kama, but even then that's a little bit complicated. For the most part, desire is seen as that which connects a person to the samsaric cycle, to the cycle of the eternal return, this almost perpetuating existence, and it's something that you want to get rid of. So you see a lot of this actually in Schopenhauer. Samsara, of course, being the Buddhist term for this. And so he sets the stage in a lot of ways for Nietzsche's articulation of the eternal return, which is basically a regurgitation of the cycle of rebirth in Southeast Asian traditions, in which desire actually it roots you in the karmic cycle. And like, for instance, in the Bhagavad Gita, to get out of the cycle of death and rebirth and to return to the unity, you basically need to surrender your desire or sacrifice your desire to a higher entity, to a higher unity. In that case, it's Krishna. And through that sort of process, you're able to escape the cycle of death and rebirth. And so Schopenhauer is a very similar thing, a very similar approach. And Nietzsche then goes on to talk about the eternal return, which then, of course, permeates a lot of religious studies and Virtue Eliade and different sort of things. So it sets the stage for a lot of like academia today and a lot of actually like psychological understandings of the human experience at this point. So he considered himself a mystic. He was heavily inspired by ancient and classical Indian thought, as you said, and his concept of salvation, which I don't necessarily think that salvation is the right word for it. It comes from the word suito in Greek, and it's a redemption from something. But really, you're not being, in Schopenhauer, you're not necessarily being redeemed into a higher state of existence. You're rather achieving a respite, which comes from tranquilizing the will via metaphysical insight that plurality is an illusion. So he sees basically the will is constantly proliferating through that tier from unity to abstract multiplicity to physical multiplicity. And Schopenhauer perceives that the tension between these different subjective, like literally subjective categories and subjective categorizations and experiences is what causes pain, is what causes boredom. And so through metaphysical insight and through the use of rationality, you can reduce experience and kind of strip away your subjective experience. And so you realize plurality is an illusion, and you, as an expression of that noumenal will, can calm the will from its desire to exist, from its desire to live and proliferate, and you can return it to that monad. And by returning it to that monad, you have tranquilized it, you've put it down in a sense, and it allows for a space in which you can at least achieve a sense of peace, a sort of Western version of a nirvana, to a degree, in which you can adopt a more beneficent mentality towards life and towards experience and towards others by negating plurality in your own consciousness. So you can see here that this is a very Eastern inspired train of thought. It's very, very interesting, and it kind of corrupts it to a sense, because to the Western ear, it kind of sounds like you're trying to end existence, right? You're trying to, you're basically, in a sense, it's the suicide of the will to an extent. And it's a very interesting sort of thing. There's a lot to think about with exactly how that fits in. Specifically when it comes to ego and to ego death and to psychological interpretations of Schopenhauer, which Nietzsche gets into. Right. So key concepts that I really like from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is most held up for his aesthetic contributions, his contributions to the understanding of art. So one of his methods in which the will can become tranquilized is what he calls aesthetic perception. Now, this is an intellectual exercise in tranquilizing the will, as we said, that's sort of returning the will to a pre-creation source before it starts proliferating into abstract multiplicity, into forms, and before it starts, those forms then start proliferating into phenomenon. Is that it's essentially you perceive the whole through the part, and through that perception and through that meditation or that contemplation, you begin to dissolve plurality. You begin to dissolve subjective consciousness. So like, for instance, if you were to contemplate an apple tree, you would see one iteration of an apple tree. Remember Aristotle and Plato and their relationship to iterations in this sense. You see one iteration of the apple tree, and through contemplation of that apple tree, you begin to understand and trace back that physical phenomenon to its formic source. And you see the form of apple, the name of apple, the form of the tree, the form of the wind rustling through the branches, the form of plurality, of numerality, of there being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. The form of the soil, the form of the colors, the form of the sunlight. And through this sort of process in which you really, go through the eye of the needle into this whole which composes the apple, then you gain insight into the interconnectedness of the forms. You gain insight into their interaction. And through perceiving the form of an object, you've taken a step towards inducting unity through this contemplation. So you've gone from physical multiplicity to abstract multiplicity. And then the artistic endeavor and the metaphysical endeavor is then to go from abstract multiplicity to the unity. So it's a step in that process, but it's the mechanism by which you can begin to see the whole through the part, and then you can see the sort of network of interconnecting wholes, and then eventually those interpenetrated wholes become the monad, ideally through Schopenhauer's approaches. So those, I think, are the key. For me, at least, those are the most meaningful aspects of Schopenhauer. There's a great wealth of knowledge and insight into Schopenhauer. Eldad was a huge fan of Schopenhauer, at least early on. And mostly, I think it comes to deal with this metaphysic and this sort of experience of ourselves as a permeation of a singular will, not necessarily what we would consider a blind will or an amoral will, but definitely permeations of this will, and that our job is kind of to see the whole through the parts and begin that process of return to the ideal where we can then begin to proliferate as that will itself. But that's the more Judaic or Hebraic approach to Schopenhauer, I would say. So moving on to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is going to be the bulk of this, because he really does require a lot of more critical thinking, especially given how Nietzsche has proliferated in Western culture to quite a disastrous effect in many cases. Right. So Nietzsche, we got 1844 to 1900. First and foremost, he was a philosopher of culture. He's definitely continental. In a lot of ways, this is a guy that we're dealing with. He was a bit of a megalomaniac. He wrote many letters talking about his, unrespected genius. He called himself the Antichrist on multiple occasions. He even signed letters as the Antichrist or as Dionysus, which is another form of the Antichrist in that sense. He describes himself also as philosophizing with a hammer when it comes to, let's say, the genealogy of mortals and of morals and beyond good and evil. When he's really dissecting Christianity, there's almost like this. I think Michael Sutra is a professor who talks about him a lot. He called Nietzsche as if he was operating with like a gleeful malice when he was really attacking the bedrock of what he considered to be the weakest part of the Western tradition, of the Western culture, which is Christianity. According to Nietzsche. That's where the concept of God is dead comes from, et cetera, et cetera. And his method is really, really interesting because he focuses a lot on psychological and sociological assumptions and kind of like deducing from his own assumptions regarding the psychology of the West, regarding the psychology of ancient Rome, of the Greek, et cetera, et cetera. And he really desired a cultural renewal. Like a make Germany great again, or make Europe great again, or make the West great again sort of thing. And he threads like a very delicate line, because I don't think Nietzsche was intrinsically a fascist. I don't. But I think a lot of his works, like he even stopped being friends with Richard Wagner because of the association because of Wagner's anti-Semitism. But like there's a lot going on in Nietzsche which can lend itself to fascistic and overly nationalistic movements, as we saw with the Nazis, as we saw with Wagner, amongst many others. but because he's interesting. Okay, like I said, there's a lot going on with Nietzsche. All right, so next. Right. So some key concepts from Nietzsche, and mind you, there's so much on him. He is probably one of the most influential thinkers since the Renaissance when it comes to the West, like easily, I would say in my book. So like we're just going on a few key concepts here. We're going to get right into it. So something that's integral to Nietzsche, and this kind of goes into that Cartesian subjectivity that was introduced into the Western tradition when it comes to morality, is Nietzsche has the concept of value creation. Now, value creation, even though he doesn't define it so much, is a theme which totally permeates his works. I would also just say that when you're approaching Nietzsche, Nietzsche is a very organic writer, and we get to that when we look at his concept of the Übermensch, which is what he actually considered himself to be in a lot of cases, or the Übermensch, which you're probably familiar with either from the Nazi approach to it or from Dostoevsky with Raskolnikov and Crime and Punishment, that whole thing. But so when you're reading Nietzsche, you're dealing with like a very interpenetrated work. So a lot of his ideas aren't necessarily formulated so clearly, but there are definite through lines. And we're actually going to end this class with talking about his first book, which is called The Birth of Tragedy. It's my personal favorite. It's about the Athenian State Theater and the aesthetics of the Athenian State Theater. He actually kind of didn't like that book, but I actually think it's one which demonstrates his point to the most, to the highest. So Nietzsche's a very interesting thinker to play around with. So his value creation, it's less defined than his traditional critique of Christianity, but it kind of emerges in tangent with it and is fleshed out passively through the rest of his works. Basically says that values are created, not discovered, right? Values are created, not discovered. Now, in the Christian sense and in more objective and rationality and or like deductive thinkers, even some inductive thinkers, when they stumble upon a desire or when they stumble upon a value, they consider it to be a law of nature, and that these laws of nature are discoverable. They're extant. They exist beyond humanity, think Platonic forms, and you are discovering this new tenet, discovering this new moral, discovering this new value. For Nietzsche, he says absolutely not. Values are 100% created by humanity, and that a value which is considered discovered is actually a desire which is imbued with objectivity, right? So that's the mechanism through which a value can be considered discovered. From the foundational aspect of that, Nietzsche says it's created. It's just an objectified desire, right? And desires are natural. And in terms of human interaction with those desires. So basically for Nietzsche, the highest level of value creation, or what he considers the West heritage of value creation, is in the warrior aristocrat. Now, remember, Nietzsche was a philologist in university. He studied the classics, and a lot of his he was a professor of that actually. So he's very heavily influenced by not just the language of the classics, but also of the heroes. He's very classically educated. He's a genius at it. So when he's thinking about the heritage of the West, he's looking at the heroes of the Greek, of Homer, and of the Greek epic poetry, and of the Athenian state theater. And in this period, you see basically warrior kings, you see warrior aristocrats who are imposing their will upon the world. And that imposition of the will is the creation of a form of value, right? And for Nietzsche, remember, people are animals, right? There isn't necessarily an objective, like a god, so to speak, which creates values which can then be found. Human beings are very much a part of nature, and they create these values and they institutionalize these values by imposing their will upon the world. In a lot of ways, imposing their desires. And also, beyond even the warrior and aristocrat, Nietzsche was also an aesthetician. He sees the artist and aesthetic creation as this very similar imposition of will. So you have this physical force, but you also have the spiritual force. And he actually deals with art in a very interesting way, because when we remember back to Schopenhauer, when we're dealing with the concept of the world as will and representation, Nietzsche kind of sees art as this mitigation between the will and the world as representation. So it's this communication between the noumenal and the phenomenal. and he sees it as one of the most beautiful pursuits. And this is something that people often forget about Nietzsche, because they deal mostly with his like Übermensch and with the things with more like disastrous like political implications, even though he really is talking about like a noumenal sort of reality. But Nietzsche was a huge fan of the arts. Like it is some of his aesthetic stuff is just absolute gold. So yeah, so that's value creation, which underlies it. It's subjectivity attached to the imposition of will, and that imposition of will creates a sort of objectivity, but not quite. Right. So the will to power. So I want to read this quote from the Antichrist, which I actually do have a few Nietzsche quotes here because Nietzsche is very dense, but he's also very beautiful. Like he's very poetic. I think one of the biggest contributions he made to philosophy, just from my perspective, is like he brought poetry back to it, which like in terms of his prose. And a lot of the French inheritors of Nietzsche, like Deleuze and Guattari, they really lean into this almost like it's almost like literary philosophy, and I think it's absolutely gorgeous. Anyway. So what is good? Everything that heightens the feeling of power in man, the will to power, power itself. What is bad? Everything that is born of weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power is growing, that resistance is overcome. Not contentedness, but more power. Not peace, but war. Not virtue, but fitness. And virtue in the sense is virtue, which is like a virtue that is like free of morals to a degree. And so that's from the Antichrist. So basically what Nietzsche is saying here is that when you look at what is happiness, the feeling that power is growing, that resistance is overcome. What is good, everything that heightens the feeling of power, which is that concept of growing, of overcoming resistance, and the will to manifest that growing and that growth itself. He says that the basic condition of humanity is desiring and striving, which is leading to a worthy life. Sorry, just one second. My throat. So basically that desiring and that striving leads to a worthy life, as opposed to Schopenhauer's pessimism, which is the negation of the striving, the negation of the will is what leads to tranquility. For Nietzsche, it's all about affirmation. You don't want to tranquilize that life drive. You know, it's almost like kind of predicting Freud's death drive in a sense, but like inverting it. And so basically you have this so humanity is this will. Yes, like Schopenhauer, you're correct. There is this blind will, but humanity is this will, which desires to proliferate, to strive to grow and to overcome resistance. And I think that overcoming resistance is very important because it doesn't say eliminating resistance. So it's to overcome, right? So the question when it comes to Nietzsche's will to power, and this is where we can sort of get lost a little bit when we're defining the terms, is like, because he doesn't define what he means by power really, right? He's kind of like fumbling at the metaphysical edges of the concept of a noumenal feeling, which is like, is it power for the sake of power, or is it power for the sake of growth and creation? Now, I would argue, and this might be a pretty charitable view of Nietzsche, but this is how I like to use Nietzsche, is that it's power for the sake of growth and creation. And that power is the circumstances, both internal and external, both intrinsic and extrinsic, which allow for a person to proliferate and to grow and to refine and to expand. So think about that as like a chesed mentality, right? As opposed to a power which subjugates. Now, Nietzsche will get into the concept of subjugation, and we'll get into the way in which power is used and the very complicated dynamic about what happens. Nietzsche has a less than charitable view of humanity when it comes to sadism and the affliction of pain, which I personally am just like, whatever, I don't see that. That being said, I think Nietzsche's will to power and that desire to expand is a very useful approach to his metaphysic when it comes to humanity. And philosophically, what's very important and what sets the stage for a lot of the French thinkers, who we'll be getting to and are among my favorites, is the concept of affirmation versus negation. So remember in I think it was our Hegel class, we were talking about the difference between different types of philosophical negation. So, or like relationships between objects. So you have the concept of difference. We were talking about the concepts of difference. So you have classical difference, which is like an object like this cup is not this cup, because they are not occupying the same space and they don't have the same qualities, right? Then you have the concept of accidental difference, which is the Hegelian difference. That's relative difference. All right, yeah, I'll go in review. It's the same thing. And there's the Hegelian difference, which is essentially that the difference between objects exists to be sublated, exists to be resolved. That's the whole thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? Is that the difference between the thesis and antithesis is meant to be resolved, as opposed to classically orient an object as different. The different exists to cause a thing to become more itself. And then you have this Nietzschean sort of thing, which rejects difference as something which has to be negated or has to be something resolved, but rather something that needs to be affirmed in a lot of sense. So you have this concept of the affirmation of difference as opposed to the negation of difference. You have expansion versus contraction. And so what I think is really vital about this quote is that when he's talking about what is happiness, the feeling that power is growing, that resistance is overcome, it doesn't necessarily mean that resistance is negated. It just means that the affirmation is as such that the resistance is no longer of any substantial hindrance to growth, right? It's not necessarily an elimination, but it's rather an overwhelming via affirmation. And so that's a very important distinction when you're dealing with a positivist approach versus a negative approach to these sorts of things. And so the will to power includes the overcoming of resistance through affirmation. That can be the affirmation of difference, or it can be the affirmation of right, where it comes into the imposition of will, in a sense. Right. So Nietzsche, beyond good and evil. So humans are animals, according to Nietzsche, and he's building off of Darwin in this case. Humans are animals. We're part of nature. And he doesn't ascribe moral value to human behavior. He doesn't think moral value exists because values are created. There is no objective morality, right? There's no objective good, or there's no objective evil. There's only human nature and human action. And so when he's engaging on this sort of quest against what he considers to be a Christian morality, which he considers to be a dichotomy between a master and a slave morality, he challenges us to basically say, you look at human nature and you look at, the strong and you look at the weak. And he says, you do not begrudge a hawk or a sparrow for behaving according to their nature. You don't blame a hawk for killing a sparrow, nor do you blame a sparrow for eating from seeds and whatnot instead of, killing others. He says these are their nature. There's an amoral sort of view to Nietzsche's universe, because there is no meaning which is defined by morality, right? And vice versa. There's this amoral sort of like run of nature that's happening. And so there's the concept of the master versus slave morality. Now, this is huge to Nietzsche's work, especially when it comes to his traditional, just like I would say, like debunking to a sense of Christianity, which is that Christianity is the morality of Christianity is that of the slave. And the operative, and he basically does this entire like psychological historical study, or this sort of presupposition where he says that, Christianity caught on in Rome because of the resentment of the Roman underclass towards the overclass. And it was because of this resentment and this hatred that they ended up codifying all of the attributes of the overclass, like the ability to subjugate, the ability to impose will, the ability to behave selfishly, to use violence, to be individualistic, et cetera, as evil. And then this new concept of evil, it's not bad, it's evil, right? It's objectively evil. And then there's this definition of good, which results as the negation of all that is evil, right? Or the absence of what is evil. And you can see that Nietzsche wouldn't necessarily like that, because it's dealing with negation as opposed to affirmation on a philosophical level, but that this new good is basically altruism for the sake of not being selfish, right? So it's defined by its relationship to evil. And he says that this concept of evil comes from this slave mentality called ressentiment, which is that resentment. And that's what drives the entire Christian mythologization of morality. It's a mythologization of resentment. And he sees this as something which is inherently weak, which is inherently rejecting the strong because of a resentment, or I guess an unhappiness with natural circumstance. So because of this, Nietzsche then sees Christian morality basically amounting as a vindicative effort to poison the happiness of the fortunate instead of a high-minded, dispassionate, and strictly rational concern for others. So his big issue with Christianity is that you have this resentment, which is fueling a delegation of evil. And it really has to do with people just being mad at other people's success, is what he basically chalks it up to. Is he says, you should just be like, tough shit, that's how it goes, life isn't fair. Like that would basically be what Nietzsche says in a sense. And he does say that with the Ubermen in terms of the value, because remember, Nietzsche doesn't value necessarily the individual. He values the process of civilization. He values the production of culture. But in terms of like the individual, if you're not affirming and if you're not, engaging in the will to power, then like you're a sparrow, not a hawk. Like that's okay. That's nature, So he's like, stop trying to legislate for cultures, for the growth of the culture, so to speak. So he sees Christianity as a poison because of that, and how that sort of logic has infected the West and is leading to its downfall. And you can probably hear like a lot of resonances with contemporary right wing and like Jordan Peterson, stuff like that. A lot of contemporary discourse regarding a lot of different social movements in the West. Actually, the headline that I'm gonna post to you guys is gonna deal directly with that question. But that's essentially one of his views with Christianity. Like I said, he has so much evidence for this, and he gets really, really into it. I don't want to just ramble about it, but I totally could. But that's basically that. And remember, like a lot of these concepts, kind of intricate. I'm more than welcome to share a bunch of resources regarding this, or like honestly, just send you a PDF of the books because it's definitely worth reading. But remember, for Nietzsche, value creation, right? There's no objective value. And you have a slave class, which because of the priests, who are kind of like the antithesis to the warriors in a sense, are able to use their will to power to, instead of affirm life, but they negate the will to power. And as a result, they construct and mythologize this religion, which feeds off the resentment of the slave, of the sparrow. And this resentment then creates an entire sort of moralistic framework, which is bent on keeping Nietzsche's Uberman down. Ta-da. That's Nietzsche's critique, I would say. Cool. Okay, so the Uberman. So there's a couple quotes here. The first one, also this directly related to the previous, is that self-interest is worth as much as the person who has it. It can be worth a great deal, and it can be unworthy and contemptible. So if you're a self-interested person and you are behaving like a warrior aristocrat, you're behaving like somebody who's affirming the will to power, which is the overcoming of resistance and growth and becoming a master of a craft and producing. And basically for Nietzsche, he's a political voluntarist, not from Schopenhauer, the metaphysical voluntarist. I guess kind of, but also a political voluntarist, in which it's like great man theory. Like for Nietzsche, the most important people in a culture, and probably the only people of value in a culture, are the like 6 to 12 or however many great people who advance that culture forward and who grow it. And it's a very individualistic way of viewing. And we know from just our perspective that that's not even how individuals work or how people work. And Nietzsche, of course, considered himself one of these people. So for him, you can either be somebody who is affirming life, who is affirming the will to power and is acting as that, or you can be a person like a priest, like the priest in Nietzsche, who is somebody who is self-interested insofar as they are affirming something, but they are affirming something which he considers to be a negation, something that's negative, something that is decreasing the capacity for others to affirm their life as such, which has to do with that form of subjugation. It has to do with that form of expansion, growth, right? So there's kind of the binary there. Think of it as like the shepherd prince binary, but like the warrior aristocrat versus the priest. And for that, I would recommend Genealogy of Morals, because he paints an absolutely incredible picture. I'm not sure how true it is, but it is definitely a great thought experiment just from a aesthetic level. Right. So then we come up with a prescription of like, let's say like God is dead. Let's say that Nietzsche really did consider himself to have been like the end of Christianity, that he was going to be the father, like the new Jesus of the West through his articulations and through his work. And so his like ideal apostle is somebody who's called the Uberman, the Overman, the Ubermensch, right? We're familiar with this term. And this is a person who is capable of being an organic whole, who is capable of just unlimited expansion, who is, their chains are broken. They've been able to identify the chains that Christianity has put on them. They've been able to identify slave morality, and they transcend it. They're the over person. They're the person who has moved into this next phase, and they are, in a sense, almost like Kant's fully autonomous person. They are self-law giving. They are generating universal law for themselves, but it's also rapidly changing through this process of affirmation. There's a quote here, and this is a concept which it can be very hard to conceptualize. And Deleuze and Guattari try to conceptualize it in a bunch of ways, and I can't wait to get to that because it's fascinating. But it's very difficult even in the English language, because the English language is very much rooted, according to Nietzsche. It's funny because I actually happen to agree with this, in this sort of the confines of the slave dynamic, right? And we can get into that a bit, I think, in the chat if you want, but it can be kind of difficult to conceptualize, but I'm gonna do my best. So for this alone is fitting for a philosopher. This is regarding the Uberman. We have no right to be single in anything. We may neither err nor hit upon the truth singly. Rather, with the necessity with which a tree bears its fruit, our thoughts grow out of us. Our values, our yeses and nos and ifs and whethers, the whole lot related and connected among themselves, witnesses to one will, one health, one earthly kingdom, one sun. So the Uberman is this organic whole. He is not an object. He's a process. They are a process, right? And it's also important to note that when we're dealing with this sort of, as he says, like we may neither err nor hit upon truth singly, is that as with honesty and artistry and his sort of concept of that conflict between the world as representation and the world as will, which he gets into a lot with his aesthetic theory, is that some of the components which are inside of this process which is the Uberman, this process which is the tree, what Deleuze and Guattari will call the rhizome, these components exist to conflict with each other, right? It's not monistic. It is singly insofar as it is a whole, but it is not a harmonious whole. Because for Nietzsche, he says, remember, it's not peace, but war, right? There needs to be resistance to overcome. So to a degree, there is a necessity for difference, but these differences are affirmed, and it's the constant affirmation of these differences which kind of drives, and it creates this tension which causes the Uberman to spread out and to branch out and to fulfill this natural process of affirming, of growing, of striving. For Nietzsche, there has to be something to strive against, right? And so he actually says that about Christianity, is like one of the reasons why there's a lot of pain in the West is because it's been institutionalized. Well, he says that humanity is inherently sadistic, and humanity likes to cause pain upon others. I'm not so sure if that's true, but that's his point. And one of the things he says is that because the causing of pain upon others has been considered an evil action by the Christian West, humanity still needs to cause that pain. They still need to do this function, so they turn that pain internally, right? And they start causing pain upon themselves. That's something probably Peterson has talked about a lot. But this is the sort of the mechanism, within Nietzsche, is that there's always this other, and this other, and this other, and this other, and there's the affirmation of these differences, and this affirmation of difference. Well, although I disagree with a lot of Nietzsche's approaches to human nature, I do actually think this affirmation of difference to be a very interesting mechanism. It causes this perpetual growth. It causes this perpetual cycle, and this process is the Uberman. Right? It's the process of value creation incarnate, or Kant's autonomous person, but without objective rationality, because Nietzsche says that doesn't make any sense, right? So then Nietzsche says, to indulge the fable of unity, soul, person, this we have forbidden. With such hypotheses, one only covers up the problem. So and self-creation is like value creation. The Uberman is perpetually engaging in this concept of self-creation through the affirmation of difference and through the proliferation of as he says, not his single truth, but the values, the thoughts, the yeses, the nos, the ifs, the whethers, the entire pursuit of the building of culture, whether it be artistically, whether it be politically, whether it be in whatever craft in which one is interested, in which the self is interested. This is where Nietzsche's Eastern thought comes in. Is he doesn't believe in this concept of there being a singular aspect, like an I or a you, rather, right? It's rather this constant will, this constant affirming will, but it's not blind, right? It's directed. And the question of what it is directed by is complicated. He says that you can engage with a sense of self, but once you start engaging with a sense of self, you'll get stuck and you'll get trapped eventually as a slave. So for this, it's just absolute growth. It's just like chesed, like in a not in like a rachamim level, but in a Kabbalistic sense, just like an outpouring, like a flood. You know what I mean? So people are processes, and the Uberman is that process of constant growth. It's that process of constant affirmation, that process of the imposition of the will. Another Uberman was actually, there's an article by Zev Berlan I'm going to send out. I'm not going to be able to get to it so much here, but Nietzsche's Uberman was pretty, I think it was Jabotinsky who was very much into the idea. A lot of people who were trying to step out and really resist the British colonial access and anti-Semitism, as well as like Poland and the sort of European apparatus that was going on there. I mean, there's definitely a resonance with Nietzsche in these words, and you can see why. There's a lot of tools in this particular box. But right. So to bring it to the Birth of Tragedy real quick, which is his original text, his first text. This is actually my favorite, the Birth of Tragedy. I think it's amazing because I have a lot of respect for Athenian theater. The plays I think are absolutely incredible. So for him, Athenian tragedy as an art form transcends pessimism and suffering via affirmation and catharsis, right? Now, he doesn't necessarily say this explicitly, and this is something that kind of works out through the text itself, is he doesn't want to negate suffering, because if you negate suffering, then you've essentially trapped yourself into a box, right? There's no longer any striving. Right, there's nothing to overcome to a degree, but rather there's an affirming of the suffering, and through that affirmation, and through the performance of the Athenian tragedy, there's what Aristotle called catharsis, which is this sort of communal cleansing of like a miasma. There's this like outpouring of it transforms suffering into something which is actionable, into something which is beautiful, and it actually elevates suffering from that which drives you from this world to that which adds to the affirmation of life to a degree. So that's his argument in a lot of ways. And so there's a synthesis of the Apollonian and the Dionysian in art, according to Nietzsche, which is the Apollonian is like the plastic art. It's the world as representation, which is, you're dealing with statues, you're dealing with what would you call it? Like formal concepts of beauty, rules, lines, geometries, et cetera, versus the Dionysian, which is this will, which is the world as will, which is sort of like outpouring and going into it, and just the wild Dionysian ritual interacting with the Apollonian. And he kind of sees the entire evolution of art as this as a process of mitigation between these two poles, which is not a dialectical thing, because it's not one object moving and resolving, but it's rather more of a struggle. And that struggle is something which I think Nietzsche sees as, the struggle is okay, difference is okay insofar as it is affirmed through struggle, and it is not resolved using that dialectic. Nietzsche is not into dialectics at all, even though he criticized this one piece as being dialectical. Right. So the Apollonian is the representation, Dionysian is the will. And there's a really interesting thing about the Athenian theater, which Nietzsche mentions, is its placement in Athens. So in Athens, on the mount, you had basically at the bottom of the mountain, you had the Agora, which is the marketplace. At the top, you had the Acropolis, which is where the temples sat. And then in the middle of it, you actually had the theater. So you have almost the theater as this bridge between the physical and the spiritual, as this transcendental link between the two, which has like an alchemical process for Nietzsche when it comes to the creation of value and the affirmation of value. But at the same time, it's not necessarily a Christian thing. So Nietzsche is kind of okay with those Greek gods to an extent, not in the way that Schopenhauer would be, but etc. But yeah, so Nietzsche in a lot of ways, he says, God is dead, but he would much rather see theater, I think, replace that sort of, it would take the place of the Acropolis. You know what I mean? Like that sort of value creation, that self-legislation, that self-imposition. Maybe not even legislation is a good word, because legislation is necessarily negating and confining. Maybe just that self-imposition, that self-affirmation in a theatrical space would take the place of the Acropolis, I think. Right. Okay. I think we've been running a bit long actually tonight, but here is headline Nietzsche. Now this is something that I think this is a bit loaded. We've all heard it, and I think it'd be interesting to think from Nietzsche's perspective, both positive and negative perspectives on Nietzsche and its uses. Can contemporary identity politics in the West, and I would say mostly among like white liberal identity politics, because we know I think it's been commodified to a degree, at least contemporarily. Would they be seen as an expression of slave morality, according to Nietzsche? That's an interesting question. For a lot of reasons. Okay. All right. Cool. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed. And yeah. All right. So next week we're doing Foucault, among others. All right. Shavuot tov.